Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, so today we look at public-private partnership. So for the readings, the first readings look at the problems of accounting treatments for public-private partnerships. Right? The second readings it look at various issues relating to the PPP's performance. It's quite interesting. And the third one is a little bit different, and it look at how a public sector entity address the recent challenges in the during the PPP process. And the last one, it reviews the concepts underlying the accounting for PPPs. Okay. Now, for the last reading, there is no need to go into the technical accounting requirement in the UK. Okay. There are other references if you have a chance to read that, right? So that's good. Okay. So what we'll look at for today is the nature of public-private partnerships, right? What are the motivations, some examples, and also the related issues. And lastly, so we look at what are the problems involved, what are the debates, right, relating to PPPs. Okay. So first of all, I guess PPPs might be quite new to you. So in broad terms, public-private partnerships relates to any arrangements between the public sectors and the private sector partners in providing government services to the public. Right? So this is a broad ideas about some PPPs. And normally PPPs involve long-term arrangements with the private sector partners to construct and operate or provide any services, right, relating to economics and social infrastructures. Okay. Now I'd like to show you some examples of PPPs and also the scope of the scale, right, of the PPPs involved in Australia. Okay. So this one's back to 2005. So PPP is not new. It happens for several decades already, right? Since the new public management. So this is back to 2005. In New South Wales, they construct police stations, right, using PPPs. And this one is a bit too big. I'll just reduce it a little bit. Okay. Sydney Railway, and again some use PPPs, right, to construct it. Victoria, they use PPP, right, to deliver some schools, construct schools. And this is also in Victoria. They use PPP to deliver and construct a desalination plants. All right, and also some infrastructure projects. And this one, look at there are quite a lot of infrastructure projects being delivered by PPPs, and not only in New South Wales, Victoria, right? So in Queensland, they use PPPs to deliver hospitals, okay, and prisons as well. Right. This table, I just take it out from one of the journal articles. It shows the range of public-private partnership models and probably the types of services involved. So if you look at the second column here, right? So say, for example, for public buildings, the private sectors can play a role of providing the services only, and the governments will undertake all the public services, right? Another types of roles for private sectors and public sectors can be related to non-core hospital services, right, or court services. So the private sectors can provide infrastructures and auxiliaries services, right, so the related services only, and the government will deliver the core services. And for the other types, right, like the commercial facilities, right, that link to educational facilities, the private sectors can play a bigger role, like infrastructures and the partial private to public service delivery, and the government still deliver the core services. At the other end, like building roads or railway and all these economic infrastructures, the private sectors normally play quite a big role, right, from constructions to service deliveries to users, and the government played no operational role, right? So you can see there is a range of public-private partnership models, and the private sectors can play an increasing role, right, in these kind of models. So what we focus on is basically the more complicated one, right, involving building economic infrastructure facilities, because they are more long-term and therefore there are more challenges and problems involved. Now, not all PPPs has problems, right? Some PPPs, they are successful, right, if they are being used to provide some not too complicated services, okay? All right. I think I stop here and back to our slides. Okay. Now, there are different forms of PPPs. The most common one is called BOOT. I didn't put on the slides here. Right? It's BOOT, right? So that is a build, own, operate, and transfer. So the private sector partner will build the facilities, own the facilities for a certain period of time, and also operate providing the service, operate the facility for a certain period of time. And at the end of the contract term, the facilities will be transferred back to the government, right? So that is called BOOT. So this is the most common model of PPP. There are others as well, like BOOT, right? It's just build, owned, operate, and no transfer back to the government, right? The facilities will not be transferred back to the government. And the other types is like design, right? This is the private sector designed and build, okay? This is build, and they provide the finance and also manage, okay, the facilities. In Australia, we call it PPPs. If you read other articles involving UK, they call it private finance initiatives, right? So there might be different names for public-private partnerships. Okay. Right. Some of the key features of PPPs involve constructions and facilities. The private sectors normally would design, construct, finance, and maintain, and deliver the services for a specific period of time. Now, here's it involves two main components, right? One is to construct the facilities, right? And the other component is the ongoing operating and maintaining the facilities, right? So these are the usual role played by the private sector partners. And for the governments normally will contribute like the contribution would be like providing land and also capital works, etc. Right? And the governments and the private sectors will also share risk. Right? So we talk more about some risk sharing later. Okay? The private sectors will receive the payments from the government once the operations commence, right? So the payments can also be contingent upon the performance by the private sector partners, right? So it all depends on the contract provisions. Okay. And public sector comparators. Now, this is a tool to evaluate whether the PPPs is value for money or not. And it's usually expressed in the net present values, right? It's also considered some of the qualitative characteristics. So you compare different tenders, right? And to evaluate the value for money, right, for each tenders. Okay. All right. Okay. So in Australia, there is a national public-private partnership policy framework and guidelines issued by the Departments of Infrastructure. So the key principle, there are several key principles in the applications of PPPs. So one of the key principles is value for money. Well, this is a very important consideration by the governments. So the government needs to evaluate the best values, financial implications, and whether there is any benefits from PPPs. Okay. Public interest, again, is another important element of PPPs, and is normally considered as part of the overall PPP procurement. Okay. Risk allocations, so normally risk will be allocated to the party which is in the best positions to manage the risk. So the governments and also the private partners, right? So they have to share the risk between them. It's output oriented. It means that the government will specify what is required, okay, and so the private sector partners will deliver. Okay, it needs to be transparent. Information has to be available to stakeholder, right? So that enhances accountabilities, which is the next principle. Accountability is important, and the government should be responsible for the effectiveness of the PPPs. Now, engaging with the market means that there should be enough scope for the private sector to deliver the services, right, with value for money, right? Because this is open. The government open up the market, right, to the private sector, so it has to ensure that there is enough scope for the private sector partners to participate. Okay. Modify funding and financings, alternative funding models and financing arrangements, right, can be incorporated into the PPP procurements, right, if it adds values and if it does not really have a negative impact, right, on the risk allocations, etc. The last one is to the sustainable long-term contracting. As we know, PPP contracts are usually quite long-term, and so it requires effective management, right? Effective contract management over the life cycles of the project, right? So as to ensure the qualities of the services provided and to ensure that it's sustainable over the long term. Okay. So these are some of the key principles when looking at whether PPP should be used, right, to deliver the government services. Okay. So why the governments use PPPs? So the motivations largely stems from the new public management that we have looked at before, right, in the previous lecture. So under the new public management, the government believes that the private sector is more efficient, right? So the governments want to have efficiency gain, right, from the private sectors through PPPs. Okay, and it's considered as is also have value for money, right, through the PPP projects. Okay. And the governments also considers through PPPs, some of the risk can be transferred, right, from the governments to the private sector partner. Now, this is quite controversial, and we will look at some of the issues involved, right, in the risk transfer. The under the new public management, it's also believed that government should focus on core services. So any non-core services can be provided by the private sector providers, right? So it means that some of the services or infrastructure, facilities, etc., can be provided by the private sector partners. So they bring in the private sectors. Okay. Another argument is that the private sector has the skills and knowledge to provide these types of services, right? So they have better skills and knowledge than the government, right, in terms of providing some specific services. Okay. Now, before we move on to the next ones, I'd like to show you some other newspaper articles, right, that look at some of the arguments about some PPPs. Okay. So this highlights that there is argument for the private sectors to build infrastructure, right, in a way that it can reduce the costs borne by the governments, and it can also help to address some of the social costs, right, social issues such as the congestions, and through building more infrastructure, right, then it can enhance productivities, etc. Right, so there are argument for using PPP. And this one's Nick Greiner is the former New South Wales Premier, and he is a supporter of using PPP. And so he talk about why the reason why PPP deliver cost savings, right, and better project is that when the private sector bids for a PPP, it is putting its money on the line, right, because its investments is at risk. It has a powerful incentive to properly scope out the risk, right? So you talk about the private sector actually have incentive to perform better, right, to reduce the risk. And another benefit is accrued through competitions, right, in the private sector to win the bid process using cutting-edge technology designs and engineering innovations to keep down the constructions and operation costs of a project, right? So it mentions that the private sectors would have incentive to keep the costs down, and so it will be more efficient, right? So some of the arguments supporting the use of PPP, and also some if you look at here, right, the Australia is pressing productivity challenge, high level of public debt, right, and spiraling growth in government operating expenses. So so it means that the government probably need PPPs to deliver. Okay, and this one is also another argument supporting the use of private sector providers. Okay. And this one, it shows that Ernst & Young's, right, it takes the railway tender, right, in New South Wales. Very often, accounting firms is considered as having the financial expertise, right, so they can provide the financial advice and expertise to the governments in terms of managing the financial aspects of the project. Okay. So these are some of the arguments for PPP. And if you look at let's look at the examples here. This is a balance sheet taking it out from Road and Maritime Services, right? Just last year's financial statements, and it has report private sector provided infrastructures, right, of 2 billion. Okay, so it's a huge amount, and it's just like to show you the types of facilities, right, or the road infrastructure that is provided under PPPs, right. So some of these you might be familiar with, right? M2, M4, M5, Eastern distributors. If you have been to Sydney, right? Cross Sydney tunnels, Link Cross Tunnel, M7s, etc. Now, and so I'd like to show you a video, right, about the cross-city tunnel. Okay, so it look at the early stage of operations of the cross-city tunnels and some of the problems involved, right? Okay, so when you look at the video, try to see what are the problems and issues involved in the PPP's process. Okay. All right, let's look at the case of Sydney cross-city tunnel. So now, this is a typical or classic examples of what might go wrong with PPPs, right? And various governments, they learn from this case to improve the PPP's management. Okay, so the cross-city tunnels is tunnels that connect the Darling Harbour and the King's Cross Tunnel. Okay. So the purpose is to ease the traffic in central Sydney, right? And the project's construction started in 2003, right? So back to some time ago, and it opened in 2005. The project is a 30 years period, and it will be transferred back to the government in 2035. Right. But unfortunately, the private sector provider went insolvent, right, in 2006. Okay, so there was a parliamentary committee inquiry into the project, right, because there are a number of issues arise and because of the failure of the private sector provider, and so the committees investigate issues like the role of governments and the contracting and also the PPP frameworks, etc. And so I tried to identify what the problems were, okay, and what happened. So what were the problems? Some of the observable problems, right, so you can see because the government tried to close the local roads, right, to make the tunnel more viable to the private sector. So just divert all the cars into the, they want to divert the car into the tunnel, right? But there was still a very low level of use, right? Because of the road blocking, it caused disruption to the road, and also some of the negative externalities, right? Such as the traffic congestions and their long travel times, right, for the travelers as well. Okay, and eventually it caused the cost blowout, right? And in relation to the risk, there were a number of risks involved. There were market risks because of the high toll level charged by the operators. This is because under the contracts, it provides that there should be no cost to the government. And because of that, it allowed the private sector operator to charge a high toll level, right, so as to make it more viable, financially viable, right, for the operators. And because of the high toll, it reduced demand, right? So you can see only 30,000 vehicles use the tunnels a day, right, instead of 90,000 as expected, right? So there is a drop in the revenue, right? And that lead to financial risk as well, right? Because of this falls in revenues, the private sector partner is unable to finance the projects, and there is a lack of cash flow, and therefore the companies went into liquidations, right, administrations. Okay. There are also some other social and environmental risks involved, like the road closures, the traffic jams, the community backlash, right, about the projects, right, and boycott about the projects. Okay. Political risks relates or to the negative public reactions, right, to the PPPs and the projects, right? Okay, so all these risks, the governments at the start of the projects, they're considering transfers most of the risks to the private sector operators, but sometimes it is difficult to transfer the risks to the private sector operators, right, such as the case in the cross-city tunnel case. There were also undisclosed contract conditions, right? So the contract were not made publicly available. Those conditions are not, the information about the contract conditions is not transparent. And also the contract was not tabled in the parliament, right? So again, there is lack of transparencies. And also the use of commercial in confidence, it allowed the governments to avoid the disclosures of why the government go ahead with the PPPs instead of using other methods of procurement. The problem with public sector comparators, as we mentioned just now, some of the comparators is used to compare different tenders, right, and to evaluate the value for money. But the reviews committee indicate that they couldn't work out how the comparisons of the tenders were made, right? So there are some issues with the comparisons of the tenders as well. Okay, so these are some of the issues that relates to the cross-city tunnel. Right? Now, so let's look at another case, right, that highlights different types of issues about the PPPs. Okay, and this is a PRISM case, right, in English and Walker's papers, right, 2004. It is one of the readings. Now, the papers challenge the use of off-balance sheet approach as a way to accounting for PPPs. Right? So the off-balance sheet approach is being justified as a way to account for PPP because it's considered that most the risks and also the benefits of ownership of the facilities were transferred to the private sector provider, right? And so therefore, since the risk and benefit has been transferred to the private sector, and therefore the government does not need to disclose the assets and liabilities on the balance sheet, so it's off balance sheet, right? So you make some access to information difficult, particularly with the confidentiality provisions as well. Right? So the papers look at Deer Park Women's Prisons, right, in Victoria. This is delivers using PPP arrangements, right, to construct and operate the prisons. And so the purpose of the project was to reduce the government costs of the service delivery and transfer risk to the private sector, right? So they have the common motivations of using PPPs. And the forms of delivery is both build, own, and operate without transfer the facility back to the government. It means that there is no recognition of assets and liability by the government. Right? So what has been accounted for, right, in this case, right, is there no recognition of assets and liabilities. The government's entities only provides the commitments, right? So they disclose the commitments and also disclose the contingent liability, right, as the obligations. So all these are off balance sheet, right? And the private sector partners also fails to meet performance standards, right, such as the management of prisons, and there are problems of securities, and things like that. Okay, and so now I'd like to show you some of the they have looked at. This is taken out from the article, right? It's a table about the performance standards And if you look at the performance indicator, right, so it's quite interesting here. So about the prison's operations, right, so they look at the escapes, or the prisoner's escape, okay? So the indicator is one prisoner every 2 years, so yeah. And they look at training, and they talk about how many modules, right, provided, okay? And the number of skills area function in which prisoners able to participate, and the participation rates, etc. Right? And talk about the health, and it's 100%. So you can see many of these indicators, they are quantitative indicators, right? But if you think about the prisons or management, most of my concern might be related to the safety issues or security issues, and there are many qualitative aspects, right? So most of the indicators are quantitative, right, instead of focusing on the qualities of services. Okay, so that is the problems in relation to the performance measurements in this case. Okay. So the private sector's providers, they fail to meet the performance standards, and eventually the project fail, right? The project fails, and so the facilities has to transfer back to the government. Okay, although the original intention is no transfer back to the government, but because of the private sectors went into liquidations, and so the ownership and the management transfer back to the government. Okay. So if we look at the risk transfer, okay, is there any actual risk transfer to the private sector? Right, so that can be questionable. So there are different types of risks, right? Not just the financial risk, but also the social risks. And very often, the risk may not be able to transfer, right? Particularly in the case that the private sectors went into liquidations or have financial difficulties. Okay, and in this case, there is questions about whether it's appropriate to use risk transfer as a basis for recognizing or for accounting for the PPPs. Okay. Right. So we have looked at the cross-city tunnel case, right, which highlight a number of problems with PPPs, and the others are English and Walker's papers. It look at the accounting treatments of PPPs. And this one is different from the other two. Right? These papers use M4 as an example, and look at how a public sector entities address the risks and challenges at the end of the contract term, right? Which relates to the hand-back process, right? When the government hand back the facilities and the ownership and the management of the facility to the government. Okay. So M4, not sure whether you know, right, is a motorway, right, in Western Sydney, and the M4 tollway project is actually the first Australian PPP project, right? So the contract term has finished, and so it has been handed back to the government. So this paper look at this process. The studies has identified some problems involved in the handling handback process. So one of the issues that they have identified is that the private sector partners may not be willing to cooperate with the government entity, right, during the handback process. The private sector partner may not be willing to cooperate on the terms and conditions, right, which was considered as necessary and appropriate, right, for the handback process, but those terms and conditions was not in the original contract written 20 years ago, right? So there is a worries that there might be some issues or some problem, right, during this handback process. There was also concerns about the private sector partners' asset management system may not be suitable, right, for managing the toll road, right, when it's handed back to the government. Okay, so there are some of these issues involved. So how did the private sector how did the government entities address these issues, right? So the way that they do it, right, is by cooperations, right, and negotiations, right, between the two partners, right. So they negotiate and cooperate through setting up a governance structure, right. So the governance structures includes a committee, right? So they have a steering committees as well as setting up various workshops, right, to discuss with the to have discussions, right, between the two parties. Okay, and also they have knowledge acquisitions, right? So through the process of informing, acquiring knowledge and analyzing the information, right? So the public sector's entity understand more about the issues involved and how to address it, and also their willingness, right, to accept responsibility, and they negotiate in good faith, right, ethical considerations, and so so through all these collaborations and negotiations, right, they try to address the problems, right. So this paper, yes, it's interesting in that not only just highlight the problem, but it also try to see how the problems and issues can be addressed. Okay, all right. Okay, so we have looked at some cases. Now let's have an overall summary, right, or an overview about the problems and the debates that we have that we can draw on from these cases. Okay. Now PPP is seen as a way to provide infrastructure to the public without actually increasing the government debts or putting pressures on the government budget. And it's considered to have value for money for the government. Now, although this is a key argument for using PPP and is considered as a key advantage of PPP, but very often it's very difficult to estimate value for money, right? Even the use of the comparators, there are issues about how to estimate the net present value, right? So when discount rate change, right, so the values also change. So so there is issues about the value for money, right? And the governments not only consider the financial size, but they also consider the quality, right? The quality aspects of the tenders as well. Okay, and the lack of government capacity, right, to monitor the projects can also lead to future cost blowout as well. Okay. Now, in terms of risk transfer, this is a huge issue for PPPs as well. Now, the principles of risk transfer is supposed to be to allocate the risk, right, to the parties who is best able to manage the risk, right, at the lowest cost, right? So this is a general principle, but normally it doesn't really work, right, in the long term with all these long-term infrastructure projects, particularly when the operating company get into difficulties, right, financial difficulties, and so the governments have to force to assumes the financial risk, right? So very often this financial risk have to be borne by the government again, right? If the operators went into difficulties, okay? And also certain risks is difficult, they're difficult to be transferred, right? Such as the social and environmental risks that we have looked at just now, right? All these traffic jam, they are negative externalities, right? So all these negative externalities, the private sector operator may not be in a position to manage it, and so the government has to handle all these risks. Transparency issues is important, and so the use of commercial in confidence contract has to be carefully considered. because of the transparency issues, and the lack of public disclosures or transparencies can reduce the accountabilities, right, government accountabilities. The private sector's operators also needs to be aware of all these accountabilities and the public interest issues as well. Okay. We talked about externalities just now. Like the traffic problem, right, in the cross-city tunnel case, and the governments have to deal with the externality issues, and government normally in a better position to do that. So these kinds of externalities may not be able to be transferred to the private sector. Okay. Performance measurements, including the reportings of non-financial informations, is important because it will help to monitor the qualities of the services and also the progress of the projects, right? And any other issues such as the social and environmental issues, right? Effective governance and negotiation is also important, right, for better monitoring of the PPP process. There should be open communications between the parties, okay, and better project management, such as the design and the framework of the project is also quite important. Okay. Now, up to here, let me show you some examples of the problems involved. There are some interesting newspaper articles. This is back to 2015 in Victoria. Right? So the Victoria government at that time, they want to terminate a PPP contract, right? But this would involve a huge compensation cost. Right, so there is something to consider when the government use PPP, right? If the government want to terminate, right, the compensation costs involved can be quite a huge amount. This is about the Sydney Light Rails, right? You might have heard about the stories. The Sydney Light Rails has PPP projects, and they have a lot of issues and cost blowout, right? And it's still constructing. The business case secrecies, there is a call for ending the secrecies, right, and disclose the business case for using PPPs. This similar case about some disclosure of the contract, there is quite controversial. So whether there are different arguments about the level of disclosures of the PPP contract, and so is talking about some PPP need to be transparent. Okay, so the transparency issue is quite important. Now let's look at the accounting and reporting issues. Right? So how PPP arrangements should be accounted for. Now we won't go into the details of how to account for PPP, but we look at the concept behind the PPP. So there are two common accounting criteria for accounting for PPPs. One is the risk and rewards that we have talked about just now, right? Particularly in English papers. So risk and rewards focus more on which parties of the PPPs bears majorities of the risk and reward, right, of the managements and ownerships of the facilities. Okay, so the parties which bear the majorities of the risk and reward, right, should account for the PPP arrangement, right? So as we see in one of the case, because most the government consider that most of the risk and rewards has been transferred, and therefore they don't account for it. The other concept is control concepts. It refers to which party control the assets, right? Control the facilities. And for the public sectors, it's quite difficult to identify the level of control because normally the project is quite complex, right? It might be easier for the private sectors to identify control, but when it applies to the public sector, it can be a bit complicated, right? So if we look at the first ones, right, the risks and rewards, previous practice is based on the lease accounting, right, to account for the PPP because previously there is no accounting standard specifically for PPP arrangement. So the governments they use the lease accounting. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with lease accounting. Okay, so there are two types of lease. One is finance lease, the other is operating lease. So finance lease, the entity has to report, recognize and report assets and liability on the balance sheet. And operating lease, they don't need to, right? They just write it all as expense. Okay, so one of the criteria of lease accounting is the risk and rewards concept, right? So if the entities bear the majorities of risk and rewards of the ownerships, right, then they have to account it for as a finance lease and therefore record it as assets and liabilities. Otherwise, they don't need to. And because of that, because of the risk and rewards concept, many PPPs arrangement has been classified as off balance sheet, right? So they don't recognize assets and liabilities. Okay. So the International Public Sector Accounting Standard, right? They have a standards on service concessions arrangement. So that is relates back to some of these long-term contracts. Okay. And the International Public Sector Accounting Standard adopts the control concepts, right, for this service concession arrangement. But the focus of the focus of control is more on the regulations of the service concessions arrangement, right? So if it's only based on the regulations, right, the concepts of controls it can be a bit narrow, right? So what is in Australia? Now, the interpretation 12, right, service concession arrangements, it provides some accounting guidance on the recognitions and measurements of the arrangements, right? But this interpretations applies to private sector operators, okay? So, and it largely refers to the existing accounting standards, right, such as construction contracts, revenues, etc., right? So as to be in line with the existing accounting standard requirements. And the other one is the interpretations, right, 125, service concession arrangement, and this one just focus on the disclosure aspects. Okay. All right. And more recently, there is a new accounting standards, right, WSB 1059, the service concessions arrangements, grantors. Remember just now we mentioned about the interpretation 12. This one's focus on the private sector operators, right? And the new accounting standard 1059, it focuses on the grantors, right? So that is the public sector operator, the public sector entities, okay? And it released in 2017, effective from 1st of January 2019. The accounting standards is based on the International Public Sector Accounting Standards that we look at just now. It's based on this one, okay, the service concessions arrangements. And so it means that they adopt the control criteria, right, for accounting for the PPPs. And because of that, PPP assets and liabilities has to be recognized, right, on the balance sheet. And so there is the public sector entities cannot use the off-balance sheet approach, right? Now back to the lease accounting, right? Although previously the public sector entities, they can use the off-balance sheet approach, but because there is a change to the international accounting standards, right, all the assets and liabilities for lease, right, they also need to be recognized and reported on the balance sheet, right? So that means, there is limited scope for off-balance sheet transactions, right? Okay. So PPP assets and liability has to be reported. Okay. All right. Finally, what are the overall implications, right, of PPPs? So the most important implication, right, for accountabilities. So both the governments and the private sector partners has to be aware of the accountability obligations, right, and they which also involve the public interest. So that means the private sector partners has to be made aware of the public interest obligations, right, when they provide the services. Okay, transparencies of the contracting process, which is important, right, particularly related to the transparencies and the provisions of the informations, so as to enhance the accountabilities. Okay. The role of governments is important in managing the complex projects, and particularly those involve negative externalities, right? For many long-term infrastructure projects, they normally involve externalities, so the government have to play a role, right, in managing some of these externalities. Okay, so I think, so that's all for the topics. Okay, so, and we finished for the topic. Okay, all right.